Hello, and welcome to Analysis with me, Oliver McTernan. In Bangladesh, the ruling Awami League won last weekend's election amidst violent clashes that killed more than 20 people. The political outcome was never in doubt after a boycott by the main opposition party, who called the elections a scandalous farce. The Bangladesh Nationalist Party has demanded that the results be declared null and void. Widespread violence erupted across the country on Sunday. Scores of polling stations, many of them schools, were torched and violent clashes broke out between opposition activists and the police. Voter turnout appears to have been particularly poor, and just over 20% reportedly taking part in the election. The political situation in one of the poorest countries in the world is raising many questions amongst analysts. Is the deepening conflict between the Bangladesh's two political parties increasing political violence? Is the new government legitimate after the boycott by the opposition party and the violent clashes? Should the international community do or have done more to help? Can the results be voided as demanded by the opposition parties? Now, to discuss these issues with me, we have here in the studio Murad Qureshi, a member of the London Assembly, John Kamek, a barrister, Talha Jamel, the Bangladesh Crisis Group, and on Skype we have Brad Adams, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch Asia's Division, and on the phone from Bangladesh is Bijwajit Chanda, Assistant Professor at the University of Rajshahi, Bangladesh. Welcome to you all. But before we start our discussion, let's watch the report by Alex MacDonald.
After a tense and highly controversial general election, the Awami League has been swept back to power in Bangladesh. The election occurred against a backdrop of violent clashes by opposition parties and protesters, who say the voting was rigged. Opposition leaders called for a boycott of the elections, which eventually led to many uncontested seats going to the Awami League. With most votes counted, the Awami League won 105 of the 147 contested seats, with allied parties or independent candidates taking the remaining 34.
I tried my best, I told you. I offer ministry, I offer to share power with our opposition. I have done as much as I can do, but they didn't respond. If they realize that they made a mistake not participating in the election, perhaps then they may come forward.
Since 1991, all elections in Bangladesh were held under a caretaker government who were meant to ensure neutrality and prevent corruption or vote rigging. In 2010, the Awami League abolished this prerequisite, arguing it was no longer necessary. Some have suggested this opened the election up to underhand tactics.
This election commission is absolutely spineless. It's subservient to the government. It's a puppet of the political party. So their data is totally not acceptable. We have the data from the various centers, and according to that, so far, only 3 to 5% votes have been cast.
Political tensions in Bangladesh have been high since the execution of Abdul Qadir Mullah, a senior leader of the Jamaat-e-Islami party, in December. Though ostensibly hanged for crimes committed during the 1971 War of Independence, many viewed his execution, as well as the conviction of 4 other leading figures in the party, as a political move designed to stifle dissent. For the last 30 years, political power in the country has repeatedly alternated between Sheikh Hasina and Khaleda Zia, the leader of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, who called for a boycott in this election. In the 2008 elections, voter turnout in the country was over 70%. This time around, barely 20% of the country turned out to vote, partly due to threats of violence. The outcome has left a bad taste in the mouth of many Bangladeshis.
The election was supposed to be peaceful, but it was not so. There were not a lot of voters in the polling booths.
I see in the newspapers that there was massive fraud in the Dhaka polling stations and that many people were killed. To me, this is not an acceptable election.
Since the brutal War of Independence, which gave birth to the modern state of Bangladesh in 1971, the country has struggled to maintain its democracy in the face of numerous military coups. Although that doesn't seem to be on the cards this time around, tensions are still very high. Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
Murad, given the bitter divisions that exist in Bangladesh at the present, what hope do you think there is for the country?
I think the best we can say about these elections is it was a one-party general election with very poor turnout. Bangladeshis historically have come out in their masses for elections. We see that here in London as much as in Bangladesh, so the 20% turnout is very disappointing. But oddly enough, in a kind of constitutional and legal sense, that there is a mandate for the continuation of the present government. And that's why I think the military have stayed in their barracks, because historically we've seen them intervene time and time again when they feel the violence has got out of hand, and it really has got out of hand. We lost 20 members of the public, polling stations were bombed and attacked. It's not the way to conduct an election at all.
And do you anticipate an increase in politically motivated violence?
The interesting thing, last time I appeared on Analysis, I was expecting an emergency before the election. If anything, I still expect that, but now that the election's out of the way and the negotiations have started, I'm not convinced the positions being taken are going to be helpful. There's such personal animosity between the leaders as well as the parties, and we saw that a few months back. With a telephone conversation between the two leaders where, quite honestly, it didn't serve any purpose.
John, what would you say are the main causes of the present crisis?
Well, I think a lot of the roots of this crisis have been or stem from the Awami League's election victory in 2009, when, of course, they won on a landslide with a promise to try the alleged war criminals. I think given that that was one of the central planks of their manifesto, and given that they've carried out with, I was going to say prosecutions, I think persecutions is a better word to use, with such unremitting force, and given that, you know, we've seen the first execution take place recently, escalating violence throughout the country over the last 2 to 3 years during the period of these trials. I think really, particularly when you look at the Islamic community in Bangladesh, that has been what has lit the blue touch paper, if you like. And so what you've had really in the last few weeks is a perfect storm of Abdul Qadir Mullah's execution, coupled with crackdowns all over the country by an Awami League government that has started to resemble a single-party police state type of government rather than a democracy.
But do you think the polarisation is driven by a grievance at the heart of the country, or is it more ideological polarisation?
Well, there are others far better qualified to answer that than me, because, of course, I'm primarily involved in the trial. But over the last 3 years that I have been involved in this, I think it's become clear to me that the polarisation in Bangladesh, which really emanates from something that happened 42 years ago, is as wide as it ever has been in peacetime. I think one of the fundamental problems and one of the fundamental failures of this government is that rather than use these trials as a vehicle for reconciliation, all this government has done is hold a mirror up against the past and really do nothing more than exacerbate those divisions that go back 4 decades.
And Talib, would you agree with that, or?
I agree substantially, but there are some issues. One of the things I think I need to correct is that if you look at the last election of Bangladesh Awami League, when they won the election in 2008, end of 2008, although it was in their manifesto, the trial of the war crimes, it wasn't in the priority. They identified 6 priorities in their manifesto. It wasn't there. And few people here and there did mention it in their election speeches, but most of the time this issue was not as high. So the reason it is important to correct is there could be a perception that somehow the people given mandate to the ruling Awami League to conduct the trial that they are conducting. They are not. But the deeper problem is that I think the division are partly driven by the animosity between the two major political parties, but also partly because of an erosion of what I call a genuine civil society in Bangladesh. There are very few people who can rise above the polarized partisan divide and speak objectively in all circumstances. So you'll find...
So can I just, sorry to interrupt you there, but if the political leadership were to get its act together, do you think there would be healing in the country?
Of course, but I think that's a very, very big if in Bangladesh's context. I am not hopeful at all. I think for Bangladesh to come out of the current crisis, there would have to be something beyond the political. I'm not suggesting that the military should intervene. For the record, I strongly believe that no kind of military solution is ever a good solution. What needs to happen in Bangladesh is that, in one hand, the world community needs to get involved in pressurizing the two political blocs to get into debate, but also serious efforts needs to be made to create an environment in which people from different ideologies and different political persuasion can have genuine and proper objective debate, principled debate, without getting their personalities involved in it.
If I can bring Professor Chandy into the discussion now, do you think the international community has done enough to help the situation in Bangladesh?
I think the international community, especially the United Nations, they have tried their best, and some powerful countries, they have also tried, but I mean, it does not depend on them actually. The problem is internal, and the main political parties, they have to come forward to get a solution. So if they are not cordial about the solution, then external efforts will not be effective, I think.
And do you think the leadership, we've talked about how bitterly divided they are, do you think they are open to pressure from outside, or do you think that's an impossible task?
Actually, pressure from outside is not very important here. And the answer, especially to the first question you have put here, is not that straightforward. The problem is actually with the spirit of liberation movement. Related with the spirit of liberation movement, I mean, one party, the Awami League, is they want to follow that spirit, and a group of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, they also are in favor of that spirit. But another group of the BNP, Bangladesh Nationalist Party, they are pro-Jamaat Islami and pro-Pakistani. They don't want to see that, I mean, actually the secularism and those ideologies.
Please stay on the line, as we want to come back to you, but I want to turn now to Brad. Brad, given your role in Human Rights Watch, you must be deeply concerned about the violation of human rights in the country.
Yeah, it's a very, very dark time for Bangladesh. These have been the bloodiest elections in history. And I think that we have to fear that it can get even worse. It can get much worse if the situation is allowed to degrade. The responsibility is, of course, with the political leadership in both parties. I mean, most Bangladeshis are not involved in violence, not on the streets, and in fact, there are floating voters. That's why power changes hands. So there is a center ground in Bangladesh. There's a reason why no party has ever been reelected. It's because they haven't performed well in office. The Awami League has had a very poor 5 years following a BNP government from 2001 to 2006 that was, in my view, as a human rights matter, even worse. And so, there's no quality leadership. There's very few political leaders who seem to be looking at the interests of the country.
Brad,
spoil system that even reaches down to the universities and dormitories and housing. So the stakes are very high for the parties because they play this kind of winner-takes-all politics. And in the meantime, they're mobilizing people who are, particularly young men who are willing to go out in the streets and fight for one party or the other and engage in things like arson attacks. And there is complete impunity for these things. There's no expectation, for instance, that Awami League supporters who commit human rights abuses right now are going to be held accountable by this government, just as under the BNP, their supporters were never held accountable.
Murad, Brad talked about mobilization. Do you think that's motivated by, I'll come back to this question, by sort of ideological differences or a different political vision, or are there genuine grievances that are not being addressed?
I would suggest, actually, ideologically, I've yet to really see fundamental differences between the two parties. There is a difference in a historical interpretation about the liberation of Bangladesh, though, and who played what role. This is at the centre of all of this. The historical context is still in living memory of many Bangladeshis, certainly the older generation. And interestingly enough, the last election when I was there was of keen interest for the young people. They want it sorted and dealt with. It's an albatross around the neck of Bangladesh politics. The sooner, the better that it's dealt with. The sooner the country can move forward. It hasn't helped in the way that it's been done. I won't disagree there at all with opponents on the way it's been handled. And at the same time, the way the political parties actually operate, they're very, very centralised. Everything goes to the top and goes back down again. If you want to get a seat, for example, if you virtually, basically, they're auctioned. And your first priority once you get elected is to cover the cost of the outlay you've made. And as a result, it stifles any kind of political culture and things happening between elections at all.
John, you have experience of the legal system in the country. Do you think the judiciary are above politics, or are they part of the problem?
They're part of the problem. I mean, I actually went to Bangladesh before I was barred from the country. I think it was March 2011, and you know, the personality cult of Hasina and the Awami League, it screams at you from every tall building. You've got murals depicting the martyrs of 1971. What she's done vicariously through a judiciary and a Supreme Court peopled by her own nominees is create a whole new wave of martyrs. That's my concern. So this 40-year cycle could be about to start again. What you've got, and again, look, my experience of Bangladesh goes back only over 3 years, but I think I've learned enough to see that what governments tend to do in Bangladesh, and I'm sure this goes to the BNP in the past to some extent as well, is they meddle with constitutional rocks that really ought to be inviolate. So we've seen, for example, this government mess around with the Constitution in terms of rights for the accused in the war crimes trials. Only for them, other people charged with normal crimes were exempt from that change. You've seen the government set up a tribunal in its own image, appointing its own judges, own prosecutors, and later, of course, you saw a government withdrawing the nation's right to see a caretaker government imposed.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this part of the programme, but our studio guests are staying with us, also those on the line. So I do hope you will join us in the next section to continue this debate. Thank you.